Okay, so I'm going to tell you about a favorite story of mine called The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. And it begins on a nice day in England, somewhere outside London, I believe. And it is an artist, Basil, sitting with his friend Lord Henry, and they're discussing art and these sort of things. And Basil is painting a portrait. And Lord Henry is wondering who is this young man in the portrait, and it is revealed that it is Dorian Gray. And so, as this is happening, Dorian Gray actually shows up on the scene and meets Lord Henry, and he and Lord Henry sort of talk back and forth to each other. And Lord Henry's his sort of charm has an effect on Dorian Gray, and he starts to really think about things he hasn't thought about before. So then he decides, he gets really worked up and states that he wishes that the portrait of himself would grow old and that he himself would stay young forever. And this is the premise of the whole story. So, he starts to spend more time with Lord Henry, and he sort of sees him as a mentor, as someone to look up to and to listen to, ask for advice, and basically be his friend. And during this time, he meets a young actress named Sybil Vane, and he thinks she's beautiful. She's like the most gorgeous woman he's ever met or ever seen. He sees her actually performing Shakespeare's plays at a theater. And he decides he loves her, so he proposes to her, and then, and they fall in love with each other. And so then Dorian Gray invites Basil and Lord Henry to go see a play with her in it. And the night that they go to see the play, she's just awful. She does terribly in this play. She totally bombs. And after the play, of course, Dorian is devastated by this, and then he goes to talk with her about it, and she says, "Oh, well, I didn't know what love was until I met you," and all her acting, all she knew was acting before she met him, and then once she met Dorian, all of her acting passion was completely destroyed. And so Dorian decides that he doesn't love her anymore because he fell in love with her art, and now that she didn't have that ability, he no longer loved her. And so he goes home and he thinks about it, and actually at this point is when he first sees that the portrait that Basil had made of him is starting to change. And it's not very much, just a little bit of a change, barely noticeable, but he notices like a little smirk in the mouth. And he decides that it really gets on his conscience, and he decides to apologize to Sybil Vane. But before he can do this, he is visited by Lord Henry, and Lord Henry says that Sybil Vane has committed suicide. And Dorian takes this very harshly at first, but after he and Lord Henry speak about it a little while, he decides just to forget about it. And he gets more and more involved in Lord Henry's philosophy, and over the next 18 or 20 years, he starts to do all kinds of, he just basically descends into debauchery. He just does all kinds of bad things and doesn't worry about the consequences. And all the while he's staying young, and he looks the same while the portrait is getting older. And so, some years down the line, I guess 18 or so years, Basil confronts him about this, the way he's been behaving. And as he and Dorian and Basil are speaking, Dorian decides to show Basil the portrait. And they have an argument after Basil sees what has happened, and in a rage, Dorian kills Basil and tries to cover it up with one of his friends was a chemist, and he covered up the murder. And he tries to forget about all this by going to a pub where he meets James Vane, and James Vane is the brother of Sybil Vane, and he swore that if Dorian ever did anything to his sister, that he would kill Dorian Gray. And so after James sees Dorian in the pub, after Dorian leaves, James follows him with a gun and plans to shoot him. And so when they confront each other, Dorian steps into the light and shows James that he's too young to be Dorian Gray because, well, he hasn't aged, so he wants him to think that he's not the right person. And so even though James recognized him, he knew that he couldn't be the same person, so he doesn't kill him. But after Dorian leaves, one of the patrons at the pub says, "Why didn't you shoot him? You should have, because it is Dorian Gray. He hasn't aged in 18 years." And so from this point, James is trying to kill Dorian. And Dorian is really worried by this because, yeah, he sees James like sneaking around places where he visits, and he knows that he's planning to kill him. But then one day, I think James is discovered to be dead. He was killed in a hunting accident or something, and then Dorian just doesn't have to worry about him anymore. And that comes to the end of the story, where Dorian is just he starts to really think about his life and the things that he's done, and he decides that the only way that he can repent for his sins is to destroy the painting. So he takes the knife that he used to kill Basil, and he stabs the portrait in the heart. And then his servants come in, and they see Dorian lying on the floor dead, but he is an old man as this happens, and they look at the portrait, and it is a picture of him when he is young again. And that's how the story ends.